the island shrouded in mist. The mist rising over Britain was no ordinary natural phenomenon. It was an ancient curtain covering the silent closing of an era. The stone roads still stretched on, roads paved by Roman hands, like the veins of the empire traversing the island from end to end. But no longer were there messengers carrying orders, nor the heavy marches of disciplined legions. Rome was gone. Its departure was not sudden. It was not through war or great destruction. As Rome withdrew from Britain, it left behind not destruction, but emptiness. And sometimes emptiness is more terrifying than destruction. The cities that once lived under Roman protection fell silent. The sounds in the marketplaces diminished. The interiors of the stone buildings became empty. The value of money decreased, trade slowed, order crumbled. The Britain people realized that the old power that had sustained them for centuries was now diminishing. Villages began to reshape themselves. People abandoned the deserted Roman villas and returned to wooden houses. Stone gave way to earth, order to caution. Doors were closed earlier at night. Children were not allowed out after dark, because nothing was certain anymore. With the withdrawal of Rome, Britain was left defenseless, not only militarily, but also spiritually. The Britons remembered the glory of the past, but could not see the future. Old gods whispered, new fears grew and became dangerous. Every shadow, every unfamiliar silhouette on the horizon was perceived as a threat, because these lands were now ownerless, or so it seemed. The fog began to settle more frequently on the shores. The sea felt darker, the wind harsher. And though Britain did not know it, fate had already set in motion. The sea does not only carry waves. Sometimes it carries people. Sometimes it brings an era. The sea had always been a boundary for Britain. But in this age, the sea was no longer a boundary. It had become a gateway. And this gateway was slowly opening. Beyond the North Sea lay lands ruled by harsh winds and swamps. Places where the sun was stingy and the earth harsh. The Anglo-Saxons and Jutes lived in these lands. Their lives were not built on grand orders like those of Rome. Their world was simpler, but more brutal. Land was scarce. Winters were long. Hunger was always near. For these peoples, the sea was a path of hope, as much as it was a fearsome enemy. They set out on the waves in small, primitive boats. They brought with them not only their weapons, but also their women, children, animals, and gods. For this was not a plunder expedition. This was a search for a new life. When the shores of Britain first came into view, they were silent. The forests were deep and dark. The swamps were hidden. The land did not welcome the newcomers. It only watched. The newcomers sensed this. Therefore, the first steps were taken slowly and carefully. The first fires were small. The first houses were built in defensible locations. Initially, the agreements with the Britons were fragile but necessary. The newcomers were accepted as warriors protecting the coasts. In return, they were given land. This land was cultivated, plowed, and fenced. For a time, everyone benefited. But land diminishes as it is divided, and fear feeds on silence. Anglo-Saxon villages multiplied over time. Long houses rose. Within them, people, animals, and fire lived together. These houses were not just shelters, but symbols of togetherness. Stories were told around the fire at night. Memories from the old lands were carried to the new. Daily life was hard, but orderly. Men worked in the fields, hunted, and took up arms when necessary. Women were at the center of the home. They wove, stored food, and raised children. Children learn about life at a young age. Everyone had a role in this world, because survival was not an individual, but a communal effort. For these peoples, strength came not from ostentation, but from resilience. There were no kings yet. Grand thrones and golden crowns were not the subject of this age. Power was concentrated around leaders who had proven themselves in battle. Those who were heeded were not those who were feared, but those who could protect. But this order, too, was fragile. The Britons began to retreat slowly. Some took refuge westward, behind the mountains and mist. Others accepted living in the same villages as the newcomers. Languages mixed, traditions clashed. Different gods were invoked around the same fire. Changes were happening, and differences existed. And at the end of each night, everyone felt the same thing. This balance would not last long, because the Anglo-Saxons were not merely settling. They had begun to see these lands as their own. The sea was now behind them, and before them lay Britain, and this land would soon decide who would own it. In these lands, nothing was merely what it seemed. The forests were not just trees. The wind did not only bring cold, and the nights were not merely dark. In the early Anglo-Saxon world, an unseen order prevailed. Gods existed, but it was believed that there was a power older than the gods, Wyrd. Fate, a flow with a beginning and an end, but whose path never changed. People fought, worked, prayed, but in the end, everyone fell silent before Wyrd. When they gathered around the fire at night, the elders spoke. They whispered not only of the past, but also of the future. They spoke at length about every event, from dreams and signs to strange movements in the sky. A bird flying in the wrong direction, a fire suddenly going out, the look in a newborn child's eyes. All carried meaning. The gods were within life. Woden was the god of wisdom and sacrifice. He had given his single eye to wisdom. Thunaran reminded himself in the thunder. Tiw was the guardian of the promises made in war. But even the gods didn't write fate. They were only its echoes. Tensions were rising in the villages of Britain. Land was no longer enough, and this changing situation was uncertain. Borders were blurred. The same stream was vital to two different peoples. The same forest meant two different futures. Initially, there were small disagreements. Fences were torn down, animals disappeared, words hardened, and one day, the silence was broken. The first blood wasn't shed in a great battle. There was no epic battlefield, no great armies. The first blood was shed at a border, in a disagreement, in a glance. But everyone understood this. This blood would call for more blood. Britain was no longer just a shared land. It had become a coveted land. In this age, there were still no kings. But leaders were rising. Men who proved themselves in war, who asserted their will, who protected and punished. People gathered around them, because survival in this world required not being alone. That's why people gravitated towards those they perceived as strong. A new order was being born. Wooden houses, wooden castles. A world built not on stone, but on blood ties. The Britons were no longer at the center of this world. Some clung to their old gods. Others melted into the new order. The language of Britain began to change. Songs were sung differently. Different stories were told on the same land. But the land listened to them all, and it was about to make its decision. As the mist rose again, Britain was no longer the old Britain. And these people would one day be known as Anglo-Saxons. This first era was only the beginning, because very soon, wars would escalate, kingdoms would be born, and names would be etched into history. The story was just beginning. The silent birth of the Anglo-Saxon world. Britain was no longer silent, but this silence didn't carry the noise of the pre-war era either. It was the sound of a settling world. After the Roman withdrawal, the island had long held its breath. Now it was beginning to breathe, slowly, deeply, and carefully. Anglo-Saxon villages had moved inland from the coast, to the edges of forests, along riverbanks on high but protected hills. These places were carefully and thoughtfully chosen. The earth, the wind, and the water were observed. Because for these people, settling was not just about building houses. It was about making a pact with the land. The interiors of the longhouses were always lively. People and animals lived under the same roof. The fire never went out all day. Smoke rose not only to keep warm, but also to ward off evil spirits. Children grew up around this fire, listening to stories here. For them, the world was as vast as the light of these flames. Nature in Britain tested the newcomers. The land was fertile but foreign. The forests were generous but deep. Everything could be taken, but at a price. Therefore, there was no haste in the Anglo-Saxon world. Land was claimed piecemeal. Distance between villages was deliberately left, because everyone knew to grow meant to attract attention. The Britons were still here, but they were no longer at the center. Some lived on the fringes of the new villages. Some retreated westward, beyond the mists and mountains. The old languages continued to be spoken, but no story was told the same way anymore. The memories and traces of Britain were beginning to fragment. The same land was beginning to carry different meanings. At night, the gods were invoked more often around the fire. Woden's name was whispered for wisdom. Thunir's name was felt not in the sky, but in the courage within the people. But everyone knew that even the gods alone were not enough, because there was a power above them, Wyrd. Wyrd was inexplicable. He was felt, whether a village was built in the right place, a child's future, whether a leader would rise. It all depended on the flow of the Wyrd. In this age, leaders began to emerge, but they were not kings. They were not crowned. They did not sit on thrones. They were men whom people followed. They were strong in decision, not in war. They knew when to wait, when to speak. People did not choose these leaders. They emerged in time. Ties were forged between villages. Marriages were made. Communal ceremonies were held. Land was not just divided, it was shared. But this sharing was fragile, because each new generation needed a little more land. And Britain felt it. Some nights the dreams grew heavier. The elders spoke less. The young looked at their weapons more often. There was no war yet, but there was preparation. This is how the legends of this age were born. Not with swords, but with whispers. Not with blood, but with expectation. The stone world of Rome was being replaced by a world built of wood and words. This world was more fragile, but more alive. It heard and felt more deeply. People no longer trusted empires, but each other. Britain was changing, slowly, silently, but irreversibly. And this silent age would not last long. For when Wyrd acts, he first sends a signal, then chooses names. And very soon, those names would be written in history. There are no kings yet, but the kingdoms were beginning to be felt. Britain was no longer silent, but this sound was still not a war cry. It was the sound of an age when names were born. As Anglo-Saxon villages multiplied, people began to name the places where they lived. A river was no longer just water, a forest no longer just trees. For something without a name could not be protected, and a place with a name carried destiny. Lands called Kent began to be referred to in this way. Mercia was named with a word meaning border. Northumbria became a name that carried the harsh winds of the north. These names were first whispered, then around fires, then at ceremonies, and finally by other people. Now, there are not only villages, but regions, and regions demanded leaders. The leaders of this age still did not wear crowns, but people gathered around them. For when some men spoke, the fire fell silent. When some men walked, people made way for them. Power was no longer in the arm, but in the word, and those words were now shaping the future. These leaders began to tell of their ancestry. One was said to have come from Woden. Another spoke of ancestors who crossed the sea. Were these narratives true? No one was sure, but that wasn't important. What mattered was that they were believed. The Britons were no longer just a retreating people. Some mingled with this new world. Some sided with the new leaders. Those who knew the old Roman roads were valued in the new world. Knowledge of stone was useful even in the Wood Age. But not everyone adapted. Some old settlements were abandoned. Some sacred places were forgotten. Some stories ceased to be told. And then, the legends grew heavier. People began to have the same dreams at night. The earth was split open, but no fire came out. The shadow grew, but it hadn't yet attacked. The elders said it was a sign. The Wyrd was changing direction again. The land was no longer enough. The borders were unclear. There were names, but no lines. And every place without a line would one day be drawn with blood. But not yet. This is the last part before the war. It is the birth pangs of the first true kings. It is the moment when words will soon turn into swords. Britain was no longer an island. It was a stage, an important stage, and the curtain was slowly rising. Names have been given. The lands have been divided. Now it's time to protect. Britain was no longer just a name. It was now claimed. Lands began to be divided by lines. These lines existed not on maps, but in memories. A river became a border, a hill, a center, a forest, a warning. And at the head of these lands stood not only leaders, but kings. But these kings were not crowned. Their throne was the fire in the middle of the longhouses. Their power lay more in their lineage than in their swords. A king could not declare himself king alone. There had to be a story behind him, and this story often stretched to the gods. Some claimed to be descendants of Woden. Others claimed to be descendants of the ancestors who first crossed the sea. Some believed that Britain had been chosen by itself. How true were these narratives? No one asked, because in this age, truth was. What was believed? The first dynasties rose in the lands of Kent. Mercia hardened its borders. Northumbria became the silent power of the north. But to be a king didn't mean to rule. To be a king meant to have to protect. The people began to test not only the land, but also their kings. When famine came, when the rain stopped, when plague spread, eyes turned not to heaven, but to the king. That's why being king was so difficult, because failure wasn't just personal. It was considered sacred. The Britons were now shadows in this world, and shadows have always been dangerous. Their dangerous situations would one day be revealed. Some served the new kingdoms, some protected the old sacred places, and some waited silently. Because everyone knew, these lands were not yet satiated. Small conflicts began, but these weren't wars. These were tests. A border breach, a loss of many, a vow of revenge, and each vow hastened Wyrd a little more. As the kings grew stronger, the people began to divide. Not everyone believed the same story anymore. Not everyone whispered the name of the same God anymore. Britain was changing once more, but this time not silently. This time, there were footsteps. Kings were born. Thrones were established. But Britain was undecided. Britain was beginning to change. It was breathing, but quickly and haltingly. The land was full. The rivers still flowed, but not everyone drank from the same water anymore. The forests were still deep, but not everyone could hide in the same shade. There were kings. There were names. But borders still didn't exist. This is how the first disputes began, with animals that disappeared one morning, with a barn set on fire one night, with a dispute at a river crossing. These weren't wars, but they weren't peace either. These were checks and balances. One king would measure his strength. Another would remain silent. A third would swear an oath of vengeance. And each oath called for more bloodshed in the land. For the people, war didn't begin with the sword. War began with fear. Women began calling their children inside earlier. Fires were extinguished earlier at night. Simple defenses were built around the villages. People were now watching not only the land, but also their neighbors. Kings were at a difficult crossroads and didn't know exactly what to do. War meant loss, but not war meant weakness. And weakness was unforgivable in this age. The first real conflict took place in a place whose name no one remembers. But everyone remembers the outcome. One group crossed the border. One group retaliated. And for the first time, two Anglo-Saxon communities raised swords against each other. This moment was a turning point for Britain, because on that day, the enemy was no longer just the other. The enemies spoke the same language. These conflicts were short-lived, but their stories were long. One man was told of defeating 3 men. Another was praised for surviving wounded. A king was cursed for retreating. What was the truth? No one cared, because the stories grew. And as the story grew, the war grew too. The Britons watched from afar. Some smiled, some were afraid, because they had walked this path before. In the last days of Rome, they had seen the same signs. But it was too late. Wyrd had set in motion, and Wyrd would not stop. In this age, people still prayed to the gods. But now the prayers had changed. The prayers that were once for fertility were now for victory. The fate of Britain was now being written. But this writing would not be in stone, would be in blood. And this was only the beginning. The first swords have been drawn. The first blood has been spilled. And Britain now knows peace will not return. Britain was now preparing. This was not an unplanned process. This was a nightly wait. Swords were sharpened. Shields were repaired. But what was most prepared were minds. Now everyone knew these lands would not be defended by mere words. Kings issued calls. There were short and meaningful words. Every man capable of fighting was called. No one was compelled. For in this age, going to war was not merely a duty, but an identity. The armies were large but disorganized. Every man carried his own sword. Every shield told a different story. But one thing united them all: the shield wall. The battles began in open fields, on the edges of forests, at river crossings, on flat and windswept hills. In the first great clash, the sky was silent. The gods did not speak, or men did not hear them. Shields clashed, wood split, iron and bone were intertwined. These were the moments when legends were born. One man did not stop until his shield broke. Another, wounded, did not drop the banner. A king was said to have fought at the forefront. What was the truth? No one was sure, but the stories began. For the people, war was not a distant noise. War was a silence that fell upon the fields. Empty houses, men who did not return. Women took on great tasks without delay. Women kept the villages going. The elders recounted the past. Children silently tried to understand what had happened. The gods were invoked more often, but the prayers had changed. No longer was abundance, but survival prayed for. The Wyrd accelerated in this age. People felt that fate was inevitable, but they still fought. Because in this world, fate was inescapable, but fate had to be faced. Wars created winners and losers. But more importantly, they created memories, and memories shaped future ages. Britain was now on a path from which it could not return. This path was bloody, but this path was the path of kingdoms. The sword spoke, the gods fell silent, and Britain chose its own destiny. When the war ended, first everyone fell silent. Joy was not the first thing that came. The ground was covered in smoke. The wind carried the smell of burnt wood, and people, for the first time, truly saw what victory looked like. Everyone was in awe. There were winners, but this gain was not measured in gold. One king gained more land. Another lost more men. Some grew stronger. Others lost everything they thought they possessed. Victories were recounted in songs, but the songs did not speak of the silent homes. Destruction was spoken of in whispers. For to speak of destruction aloud meant reliving it. Villages moved. People took refuge in the lands of other kings. New places, new borders were drawn. But these borders did not stop the suffering. In this age, some names grew. They were no longer just kings. They were stories. One king's name was told to give courage to children. Another's name was whispered as a warning. Reality and legend became inseparable. Who truly won? Who truly lost? The answer was whose story was being told. The people changed in this age. They no longer saw war as romantic, but they accepted it as inevitable. Belief in the gods was not shaken, but it changed form. The demands of the gods changed. People no longer asked the gods for miracles, but for balance. Wyrd grew heavier in this chapter. Fate no longer rushed. It settled. Britain was no longer a battlefield. It was a result, and every result was a new beginning. Victory was won. The territory changed, but Britain has not forgotten the price. When the war ended, Britain breathed a sigh of relief, but couldn't relax. The land was still wounded. Villages were missing. People listened to the silence. Powerful kingdoms no longer hid themselves. The city took root in the south. Mercia showed its power with its borders. Northumbria established the harsh order of the north. These kingdoms no longer only fought. They ruled. Oaths of allegiance were taken. Lands were redistributed. Taxes were determined. The king's word slowly became law. But for the people, order was different from what was seen from the throne. People returned to their fields. The land was plowed again. Markets were reestablished. Bread was the first sign of peace. Belief had changed. The gods were still there. But people no longer sought victory from them, but balance. The Wyrd no longer flowed fast. It had settled. It had seeped into people's lives. This order seemed solid, but everyone felt this peace would not last long. because the sea was still there, and the sea always brought something. Britain had entered a new era, but this era was not the last. The war is over. Order has been established, but on the horizon, new sails are appearing.